Cool. Okay, so since moving to Virginia about a year ago, I've had the pleasure of meeting some really wonderful people. Many of whom are sitting in this room today, and Professor Andi Clements is one of those people. So since first meeting Andi at a theology conference at Duke University last year that centered around the opioid crisis, I sort of found myself kind of irresistibly drawn into her intellectual orbit. And our ongoing conversations about the drivers and the trajectory of the crisis have in many ways explicitly informed the structuring of today's symposium. So Andi is a scholar who seems not just to specialize but to thrive in wearing multiple hats. And I think her research interests reflect this multiplicity. As assistant chair of the psychology department at Eastern Tennessee State University, Professor Clements has spent much of her career exploring the psychological dimensions of adverse childhood experiences and the way that these and other traumatic events become folded into broader patterns of substance use. So building off this work, Professor Clements has helped develop systems of trauma-informed care, providing guidance and resources to help train and educate people in local Appalachian communities on how to implement these systems. So at the heart of this model is this notion that healing comes through the rebuilding of meaningful and mutually responsive relationships, which kind of brings me on to one of Professor Clements' other hats, faith. So armed with the research background I've just outlined, Professor Clements is a leading force in the Holy Friendship Collaborative, whose mission is to mobilize and equip the faith-based community to tackle substance use issues in rural Appalachia. As Andi will no doubt be telling us more about in just a moment, this mission is rooted in the idea that the church, as much a collective social enterprise as it is a space of worship and spiritual discovery, can provide the kind of intensive interpersonal support that substance use treatment requires, quite literally rewiring our brains in the process. So in keeping with this transdisciplinary spirit, she's published in the areas of religiosity, public health and substance use, and the full list of which is far too extensive for me to go through right now. So instead, I think I'd just ask everyone to give their full and undivided attention to Professor Clements, who I'm privileged to now tada up to the stage right now.
I'm much shorter than you are. Okay. Usually what I do is I have slides like he just had, and I go through one after the other, just sort of pontificating. I'm going to read today because this is so important to me. I told China and Josh at breakfast this morning that several of us have been working on putting this in theory form of mobilizing the church and why, into a theory of how addiction is happening from a spiritual, physical, sociocultural, psychological perspective. But he did kind of hit on, this is what I do 28/7, I call it now, because it really is every day of my life. I am a psychology professor. We have a church in a high need area. I've been fielding texts this morning about unhoused people who need to be housed and so forth. So it's not just a theoretical thing for me. It really is a day-to-day thing. So what I want to do is we have been working probably for the last 3 years, several people in our area. I'm in Johnson City, Tennessee, which is at the tip of Tennessee, just near Southwest Virginia, where Josh has been doing his work. And so a lot of it builds on a HRSA grant that we got a couple of years ago to do just this, to do some planning toward mobilizing the church in that area. So it's a 22-county area there. And to drive from one end of it to the other will take you like 4 hours because there are mountains in between. And so this is what drives this, but there's been lots of thought that has gone through this. So what I want to do, I want to present a model of addiction through several overlapping lenses: a medical, physiological, sociocultural, psychological, theological, spiritual. And I had to include both those terms in all of those, which gets very wordy. And so that's what we're going to do. And I'm gonna take you through some of what was so beautifully set up by both of you. I was sitting there saying, "Oh, this just sets everyone up for what I'm going to say," and we have not talked to each other about it, so it must be a right thing. All right, so addiction, and I wrote this out because I want every thought in there so you can track along with me. And I've had people read it. So I hope this makes sense, but there will be time for us to discuss it. Pick my brain. I am willing to modify. I just want to put these things together because they have converged just beautifully in the last couple of years. So addiction, as it results in a large number of deaths, is being touted as the public health crisis of our time. But I think addiction is only the tip of the iceberg. Opioid addiction particularly is one tip of the iceberg. I think there can be lots of tips of this iceberg. And it signals a much greater crisis that we propose, and I'm going to use we because a theologian and I, who happens to gave birth to him, but he's a theologian now. He's got the MDiv to prove it. He preaches. But we've been working on this. And so we think it's a much greater crisis, and we propose that it stems from a lack of connection for which all people are wired. And only by addressing what's going on under the surface are we likely to truly begin to solve the crisis. We intend to make the case that the church is a vital part of the answer to the crisis by weaving together three views of addiction and their logical responses to those. Those three views are theological, spiritual, medical, physical, and sociocultural psychological. And finally, we'll highlight what it could look like to mobilize the church. I really will get to mobilizing the church. We will get to what it could look like and offer one example of how that may look in practice, although there are many. We propose that while medicine and other secular therapies offer benefit in the fight against substance use and misuse and the related problems, that true community within the church and scriptural principles from a Christian Bible add value over and above secular solutions. I did not give the disclaimer. This is going to be a very Christian talk, but it needs to be there, and you'll see why. This is not to say that principles from other religions or other religious writings do not offer benefit as well, but the theological principles that I'll present here are going to be from a Christian perspective. Mainly that is my context, and so that is what I know. And I would love for people to tackle it from some other contexts as well. I haven't seen that happen as thoroughly yet, but there could be somebody also approaching it from that way. So the problem that's being publicized, we know that drug overdose deaths are a leading contributor to premature death. The slide before had opioid deaths at about 40,000 in 2017, 70,000 deaths due to overdose of all substances. So 40,000 in the opioid arena, 70,000 including all substances. And most states saw a slight decline in 2018, but the rates are still really high in some cases. And I'm in Tennessee, and our rate still went up. So most states went down a little bit in 2018. Tennessee was still going up. And opioids, mainly synthetic opioids, are currently the main driver of overdose deaths. But meth and cocaine deaths are not far behind. Some states now have higher methamphetamine deaths than opioid deaths. And so death's not the only negative consequence of addiction, though. I speak to my public health colleagues, and many say, but we keep them alive. And it's like, yes, but to what end? Alive is good. Can't do anything else if they're not alive. But I have bigger hopes. And so substance misuse and addiction are also associated with poverty, hepatitis, bacterial infections, HIV, unemployment, incarceration, family dysfunction, and so forth. And what this map does on the left is overdose deaths, and then the pink dots are the poverty rate. And it's like chicken, egg, chicken, egg. It's the rates of both are higher in the same places. I am in South Central Appalachia, and it has been particularly hard hit by the epidemic. In fact, we are blamed for a lot of the epidemic, which is great. So we're famous for something. And as a region, we are characterized by high opioid prescription rates, overdose death rates, overdose rates in general, overdose death rates, hepatitis rates, neonatal abstinence syndrome rates that are 10 times the national average in some counties. And in fact, counties neighboring where I am, which is a fairly urbanish area. We have a university and a decent sized population, but 2 counties over, 12% of the births are neonatal abstinence syndrome births. So anyway, and also the diversion of medication assisted treatment. Thank you for the sheet with all the definitions. We in the county where I am, our treatment capacity for medication-assisted treatment is met by over 1,000%. And so we have diversion if we have met our need by over 1,000%. So what is the publicized solution to this? The publicized solution is medication-assisted treatment, the supervised use of medications to reduce illicit use, along with some type of behavioral health support. That's the most commonly recommended treatment for opioid use disorder, and I emphasize opioid use disorder. It's driven by a disease model of addiction. However, from many perspectives, it has not solved the problem. Even in areas such as ours with adequate medication-assisted treatment capacity, overdose rates, NAS rates, and misuse of substances remains high, and in some cases still rising. So if medical treatment is not the answer, logic says it's not entirely a medical problem. Just saying. So the success of a solution is determined by the indicators used to measure its success. If our indicator is how broadly information about substance misuse, addiction, and medical treatment has been disseminated, I think efforts would be considered successful. The general public is well aware there's an opioid crisis. If the indicator is a reduction in opioid overdose deaths, there does seem to be a glimmer of hope. Most but all states saw most but not all states saw a slight decrease. Nationwide, there was a 3% decrease in overdose death rates. I am a statistician and research methodologist by trade, and I'm going to say it could be that it's a statistical effect because rates were so high, they have to moderate a little bit. And so it could be that. It could be the reduced availability of prescription painkillers, OxyContin, Lortab. And so people are using less lethal forms of drugs. So MAT medications, methamphetamine, while it can be deadly, it is less so than say heroin or fentanyl, or cocaine or whatever. So also cocaine may be a drug use. We didn't even talk crack. We should talk crack sometime. Or whether the emphasis on MAT and overdose reversal medications are really reducing those deaths. And Narcan has been widely advertised and distributed. I mean, I have Narcan at my church. My husband has Narcan in his backpack, So the ability to revive people who otherwise would have died might actually be cutting those deaths. True. So it could be a true indicator. And that is great. Again, without being alive, there's not much else you can do.
Andy,
yes.
Narcan is the brand name of naloxone.
Of naloxone, right. So it's like you can, if somebody is overdosing, you can, anybody, anywhere can give them a Narcan. You can get trained in 20 minutes how to use it. You can carry it with you, and it reverses it. For the moment, it's shorter acting, so don't trust that it's shorter acting than the opioid. Get them to the hospital because once it wears off, then they'll be overdosed again. So just a little disclaimer there. All right, if the indicator is a reduction in the number of people who are addicted to drugs of various kinds and an increased proportion of people who are now living as non-addicted, flourishing members of society, we're not there yet. I think we know that. 12% of the U.S. population reports having used an illicit substance within the last 30 days, 12% of the population. We propose that the continued high use of substances, the high rate of substance misuse and addiction, is because intervention efforts to date have focused on treating symptoms rather than root causes. And I should say, I don't think I say this anywhere very explicitly in here, but my sort of reason for what I do is to get at the demand side, not the supply side. Lots of efforts have been supply side, but this is all going to be focused on demand from the person who is addicted. So we propose those root causes. As we propose those root causes, it will become apparent that they intersect medically, socioculturally, theologically. And for this reason, I'm going to first outline how each of the perspectives, and then look at the overlap among them. So I'll describe a theological perspective aimed at motivating churches, clergy, churchgoers, to participate in wraparound care for people living with addiction that should increase some community support and reduce the demand for substances because the root causes of addiction will have been addressed. That's the goal. And then finally, we'll describe what that's going to look like. So the medical, physiological, when we look at all of them together, substance misuse and addiction are the publicized crisis. But in order to prevent it or address it in an effective way, it's important we know what's driving it. And that's going to differ by which of these perspectives we're looking at. So you even said the drivers and the responses, which I have got laid out perfectly. So, we just planned this. So each perspective will also support particular responses, but not others. So I'm going to lay out the drivers and responses in each of these and then kind of weave them together. So drivers of addiction from the medical physiological perspective. So medical physiological focuses on biological factors such as genetic makeup, brain structure, neurological, chemical activity, and the control of those through medication primarily. So several drivers. One is the actual physical dependence. Physical dependence occurs when repeated use of substance happens, particularly with opioids. Some individuals become dependent on opioids through the treatment of acute pain, like you were speaking of, injury, surgery, and so forth. Some may use drugs as a way to lessen emotional pain or feeling of stress. Others may begin misusing drugs just recreationally. Regardless of how somebody becomes addicted, the medical model focuses on those physical changes in the body that occur with drug use. The body builds tolerance, which causes the individual to require greater quantities of the drug in order to gain that effect or to prevent withdrawal. So another physical symptom is withdrawal from the drug once the body's become dependent on it. And that can result in severe pain, gastrointestinal problems, seizures, other just extremely uncomfortable, sometimes life-threatening symptoms. Continued use of drugs of abuse or even continued use of drugs for MAT can prevent withdrawal. Either of those does. Keeping on using your drug prevents withdrawal. MAT prevents withdrawal. And so the avoidance of withdrawal symptoms, oftentimes, rather than seeking euphoria, it's the avoidance of withdrawal symptoms that is reported as a driver of use. Initially it may be for some other reason, but then you're at the mercy of impending withdrawal. That is physical. The belief that medication can alleviate pain. A lot of this is pain driven. So belief that pain can be controlled medically can also drive addiction. Pain control and prevention has been publicized as a priority in medicine mid-1990s with the advent of the fifth vital sign. Pain is the fifth vital sign. Physicians have been trained over the years to treat pain aggressively. Patients were taught to advocate for their own pain control. And this has resulted in a low tolerance for pain. It's like, I deserve to be pain-free, I should be pain-free. And a belief that medicine can fix it. That the doctor should be able to take care of this. And so I should not feel pain. And so those all relate physiologically. And this final one is that addiction is viewed by many, and many government agencies even, that addiction is chronic. The belief that addiction is chronic, permanent, can drive addiction. Although not universal, a common view, it's getting universal, is that addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease. You even use the words, and it's everywhere. It's like plastered on billboards. Chronic relapsing brain disease, which conveys the idea that it's unlikely to improve without ongoing medical intervention. And McClellan, in an article published in JAMA in 2000, called for addiction to be classified as a disease. And then over the 2 decades since that article, the disease model has become the primary perspective supported by medicine, academia, government agencies, funders, insurance companies, whoever. And as recently as September of 2019, so just now is the first yet? Yeah, 2 months ago, a month before last. The American Society of Addiction Medicine reaffirmed that position very publicly. And so as a chronic brain disease in need of ongoing, likely permanent medical treatment. And then this final one that I want to talk about, I'll dwell on over and over. And that is physically an innate need to fill our opioid receptors. Okay? So a final physiological driver that we believe is central to explaining addiction is that humans are born with opioid receptors. We are. That are ideally filled by endogenously produced opioids that are released in response to human interaction. We propose that when early neglect or adversity prevents normal human attachment, that the drive to use and abuse exogenous outside. So endogenous opioids, your body makes them. Exogenous opioids, somewhere outside, pill, shot, whatever. That when early neglect, so the drive to use and abuse exogenous opioids becomes stronger and more likely to result in addiction if you have had them not well filled at an early age. Hence the adverse childhood experiences stuff, which I'll talk in a little bit. If there is no early adversity, introduction of exogenous opioids or other substances through chronic pain, through surgery, whatever, can still downregulate that endogenous system, fueling drug seeking. So that's looking at it. That's still a physiological thing happening, but I'm going to put some layers on top of it. So what kind of responses does this physiological perspective drive? It would fall, the things that fall into the medical realm tend to be treated medically. And so medication is the most common medical response or physical response for opioid addiction or other addictions. So opioid and non-opioid pain relievers are used to treat pain. That's a physical thing. Methadone and buprenorphine, MAT medications, are used to prevent withdrawal, to reduce cravings, and so forth. Naltrexone, which is another MAT medication, I don't know if it was in the thing, but what that does, it's a blocker. It keeps opioids from activating your opioid receptors. Is used to prevent opioids from binding so that even if you take an opioid, it has no effect. And so other medications are also used to treat other symptoms related to addiction, anxiety, depression. You saw the benzodiazepines and things like that to treat anxiety. So even the additional things that go along with addiction and withdrawal are still treated with medications. And then obviously MAT is the most universally recommended way to address addiction to opioids, but it is only effective for opioids, which is an important thing. I also want to hit on a couple of other physical things that can respond to this. One, physical therapy. If you have chronic pain, physical therapy can reduce that pain without using some sort of exogenous medication. It's effective. More effective in preventing addiction. Once someone is addicted to medication, it's going to be less effective to address that addiction and withdrawal and so forth. Exercise can strengthen muscles, maintain flexibility, keep you from getting injured so that you are less likely to have the pain, so you're less likely to need the medications and so forth. Also, we know that strenuous exercise can cause the release of endogenous opioids. You talk about runner's high, which one day I'll never get to. A runner told me once, I've jogged recreationally, and he said, yeah, once I get to mile 8, I can go. I said, that's the problem. I've never been to mile 8. So it could happen. It's not going to happen. I'll get mine other ways. But that also can fill those opioid receptors, reducing the need for the drug. So, and then also kind of overlapping and eventually leading into the sociocultural, psychological, we know that exercise is related to reductions in depression and anxiety and things like that. And so that could still be a physiological effect of that exercise that could be either contributing to or inhibiting the misuse of medications. All right, so what are some benefits and limitations of this medical model? One of the most apparent is that treatment with MAT or Narcan does seem to prevent deaths. Again, preventing death, good thing. Additionally, and this is going to get really practical for a second. Additionally, treatment can be billed as a medical expense. So that's going to increase the access to treatment because it can be billed because it's medical. The treatment recommendations are being disseminated by experts. We respect our physicians, and so it's likely to be believed by the public. Also, it's created for a push for society to see addiction treatment as falling within health care. We have this right to health care. Therefore, it's important that we lobby for folks to be treated instead of, oh, it's just all in your head, which happens a lot. I'm a psychologist that's sensitive. All right, so there are also some noteworthy drawbacks, though. The MAT, while effective to reduce opioid overdose, is only effective for opioids, also has side effects, also diverted, also there's the problem of economic impact for those who provide medication-assisted treatment. I mentioned the over 1,000% of the need met. While the pill mills for prescriptions has dried up a bit, the market for providing medication-assisted medications is rampant. It is like, if you look at Northeast Tennessee, I'll just throw out a number. If you have your full patient load met, we have cash-only clinics, so you don't have to bill, you don't have to say anything, whatever. But an individual provider can make $44,000 a week. Yeah. So why is it driving? I don't know. It's because they love the people. So anyway, I'm just a little jaded because I work on the side of the people who are living with that, and I think there's a lot of exploitation going on and room for exploitation. So we can talk about that over lunch. All right. So next model, sociocultural psychological. This has been prior to the advent of MAT for opioids, the addiction treatment has been primarily in the purview of psychologists. And so historically, after detox, if someone needed detox, it was primarily psychological treatments that were most popular, most used, and so forth. And so it started out with a lot of behavioral therapy, punish the bad behavior, reward the good behavior. That morphed into more of cognitive therapies. Let's problem solve and think about alternative solutions and address the feelings that you are feeling and what is a better way to approach that and so forth. But with the advent of medication, what we do now is psychology is seen as an adjunct to medication-assisted treatment. And we can talk more about that, how that is being played out in Tennessee. I'm not sure about Virginia, but I know how it's playing out in Tennessee. So what would be the drivers, psychological, sociocultural drivers of addiction? The first and one that we see often is numbing emotions, just a way to numb emotions. So one of the most commonly reported psychological reasons is treating emotional pain. So people often will say, I just want to turn this off, for whatever reason, and that can be from a lot of different things. SAMHSA has released an information sheet highlighting the confirmed connection between adversity and adverse childhood experiences, which I do a lot of work in, and substance abuse. And so self-medication to numb emotional pain resulting from adversity in childhood or even adversity in adulthood, for whatever is causing your pain, that is seen as one of the most common roots of addiction. And one of the things that really drives us home is the ACE study. If you're not familiar with it, I don't have time to teach it right now, but it was published originally in 1998, but there's a 10-item questionnaire used. Did any of these things happen when you were a child? And one of the most convincing pieces of that is one of the, just like, oh, and by the way, it also predicts this. It predicts a lot of things, but a male who had said yes to 6 of those questions was 46 times as likely to be an IV drug user compared to a male that had not experienced those. Like, oh my goodness. I mean, we look at this 12% increase in this. That's a 4,600% increase. So it's like, okay, this could be connected. So the numbing emotions can also happen without past adversity or past, childhood adversity. A lot of the things can be brought on by the substance use themselves. Like hopelessness can result in drug use, but drug use can also drive you to hopelessness through, economic adversity, loss of family, those kinds of things. So it's very much a cyclical thing going on. Also, we see, and this is going to be important and where I end up, is that we know that addiction drives people to become more isolated. Isolation can also fuel that addiction, which I will tie in a minute back to those opioid receptors. We also know that depression increases the likelihood of becoming addicted, but we also know that withdrawal from substances can produce depression. Depression is one of the side effects. In fact, the depression tends to last longer than the cravings with withdrawal from particularly opioids. All right, so another piece that is that may drive drug use in kind of a different direction is seeking social connection. I keep throwing the social connection out. That's where I'll end up. But some people, particularly those who are socially inhibited, may use drugs as a way to connect to a social group. It reduces their inhibition, their anxiety. They're more likely to connect to that group. And then the drug using may also be fostered by affiliating with a group who uses drugs, who you ended up affiliating with because you use drugs to affiliate. I know that sounds very circular, but it's not kind of like this self-perpetuating thing that's going on. So the isolation can be a problem, but also just that social connection can be a problem and can drive the drug use itself. And then, again, a while ago I said that medicine can keep you pain-free, but there's also this belief, which is more a psychological thing, that I can be pain-free. It's like, I deserve to be pain-free. It's not right that I'm not pain-free. And that's more of a psychological feeling that it is unfair and that I don't deserve and that I deserve this thing. And so I want to talk a little bit about some responses that would come from a psychological, sociocultural perspective, absent the theological piece, and then I'll get to the theological piece. So psychological therapy, obviously, that's, like I said, that is one of the most common things. And there are several types of therapy that are successfully used with addiction treatment to find, well, nowadays the prescription is to put that together with medication, but you know, that can be a good thing, but I think you can have therapeutic benefit with or without the medication. Recovery groups, which were quite common, AA, NA, DDA, DAA. All of these are psychological in nature. It's a support group of other people dealing with emotions, talking it out, befriending others, having this common theme. And we do have evidence that those are quite successful. And those do sometimes overlap the theological, sometimes they don't, depending on the type of group. And then mindfulness, meditation, yoga, that realm of things, which also we know are therapeutic, are helpful, a way to self-calm without using a substance to self-calm, a way to be thoughtful, mindful about your emotions, where they come from, or your drug use even. Those can be beneficial. So some benefits and limitations. One of the most beneficial things, I think, with adding the psychological piece is that it does begin to deal with the underlying reason that you're using, not just the physical response, but the reason that you're using. And so these methods also often deal with, include problem solving, coping, building coping mechanisms, and so forth. So rather than just dealing with the physiological dependence on the drug, you're also including in there building some life skills around that I think is very, very important in addressing this. You can't just treat the body in isolation. Some noteworthy shortcomings of that: just therapy alone does not prevent you from overdosing unless it keeps you from using the medication, but it's not going to reverse an overdose and things like that. So I think the medical is important. But it also tends to be less well-funded. Behavioral health is like, oh yeah, and by the way, let's have some behavioral health. I think we could put a lot more funding into that. It just seems to be, biology is an easier thing to fund. It takes longer. You know, I can write you a script and you can go fill it, or I can spend man hours every week being with you. And so quicker fixes tend to be the way we are driven. All right. So now then, I want to get to what I really want to talk about. The theological, spiritual ideas about substance use, misuse, and addiction are not widespread because religion is usually seen as not universally applicable, but more of an add-on for people who choose it. All right. We propose that the de-emphasis of the theological, spiritual perspective may have prevented us from considering what may truly be the root of addiction, and we're going to aim to make that case. You can look at this all without the religious piece and just look at from biology and connection, but I'm not. So we believe that humans were created to live in community, and the presence of intimate community or lack thereof explains addiction spiritually, physically, and psychologically. So biblical teaching supports that humans are created to live in community. Community is lauded from the very beginning of the Bible creation story. Each day, as God added to his creation, he described his work as good. When he created man, he specifically declared that he has made man in God's image, which contains this embedded understanding that God exists in community as the Trinity. That's not on your sheet. Sorry, lunch. We can talk. God, they didn't know to put it there. God speaks of himself in the plural, even prior to the creation of man. After creating man and placing him in creation, God, for the first time, described a part of creation negatively, saying, "It is not good that man should be alone." Upon creating the woman and placing her into creation with man, God declared the work to be very good. Creation in its perfect form required community. The community was not just a matter of proximity to another human or the ability to connect through conversation. Community in its perfected form was deep, intimate connection that is best illustrated by the phrase, "The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." There was nothing between them, nothing to hide, no guilt, no shame, completely comfortable in their own skin, literally only in their skin. So a familiar though clothed level of intimacy and comfort within community is found in the church in the early New Testament, which is described in this way: all who believed were together and had all things in common. Christians were not hiding anything from each other. They were not withholding anything from each other, and they were flourishing. Okay, so what happened? Sin destroyed the community. The biblical view is that people disobeyed God, which biblically we call sin. And once perfection of creation was marred by the sin, the first tangible symptom in the Bible was the breaking of community. Just as perfect community had been demonstrated through vulnerability and intimacy, immediately following that event, the intimacy was gone, and the first thing they did, the first thing we're told, is in the eyes of both were open, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves made themselves loincloths. So immediately there was something between them. They hid something. They were behind something. They were, hiding and so forth. Immediate reaction to the presence of sin was a desire to hide oneself from others. Because humanity was designed for community and the fall corrupted the community, it should not be surprising that the presence of sin leads to attempts to soothe the discomfort from broken community. The presence of sin leads to deeper despair and ultimately to death. Okay. So, the Christian Bible indicates that a central focus of the Christian church should be the desire to bless the community they exist within. The idea of being for others, like wanting their good, is at the very core of the mission of the people of God and has been from the very first interaction between God and believers. The church was designed to be known for the way members love one another and thus model their created nature of being in community. Jesus said himself, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another." He confirms that this has always been his purpose. For this is the message you have heard, and these all have citations if you want them. For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. True community that leaves mankind feeling fulfilled rather than in need of finding alternative solutions for removing pain is biblical, but also supported psychologically and physically. So how would a theological model drive addiction? All right. So from a theological, spiritual perspective, we believe the central driver of addiction is that humans were created to live in community with one another and with God, and when the community is lacking, we seek to fill the void. There's back to that endogenous stuff. So if humans are physiologically, emotionally, and spiritually created to thrive in community with others, lack of interaction could physiologically drive addiction. As we stated earlier, our bodies were created with opioid receptors that are filled with endogenous opioids when interacting with other humans. When those receptors go unfilled or underfilled, we're driven to fill them. I don't think I have that slide yet. Nope, not yet. Oh, we could put that up there. That looks nice. I have a slide that will show this. Emotionally, we seek to drive to fill those with exogenous substances. Emotionally, we're driven to connect with others And without that connection, we seek to numb the emotional pain of loneliness. Spiritually, we're designed to connect with others, providing instruction and accountability to think and behave in ways that align with the Bible. When we fall short on meeting those biblical standards, we feel guilt and possibly isolate from others and may use drugs to distract or numb our emotions. So the same thing can be put into any of those three arenas. And I'm going to say all of them together at the same time. So lack of community with God also could be a driver of addiction. Failing to be at peace with one's creator is likely at the root of addiction according to Christian teachings, yet this is not addressed in most addiction prevention and treatment, other than biblically based 12-step programs, in which case that is a very large component. Most recent messaging around addiction uses the phrasing chronic relapsing brain disease, not a moral failing. So it's already set up a false dichotomy that addiction is either physical or spiritual. You've already said it's not that, with nothing necessarily to back it up, without anything to back it up. So the message creates false dichotomy that addiction is either physical or spiritual. In the Bible, disease and pain entered the world as a result of moral failing. Thus, there can be no dichotomy. It's either and or both. And we'll attempt to make the case below that addiction exists in a system where physical, psychological, and spiritual are intertwined. So, what responses would this foster toward addiction? And this is going to sound very different from the last two that I've talked about. So, responses to addiction that would fall within a theological, spiritual perspective focus almost entirely on building community among people and with God. They don't necessarily preclude medical or psychological responses, but the motivation is very different. So the first, being with people. Simply being with people can build community that may reduce addiction. The beginning of community is physical proximity. So just being in the presence of other people. However, truly being with people involves not only physical proximity, but also being mindful in the present, listening, and remaining even when remaining with someone is difficult. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Being for others. So being for others, not just with them, but for them, will also build that community. True community that leaves people feeling connected is not self-serving or even neutral and objective, but should be motivated by care for and desiring good for others in that community. So just as intimacy is shown to activate the endogenous opioid system in maternal-infant bonding, it is deep caring that will foster true community and may activate that opioid system that is craving those opioids. Not stigmatizing. So not stigmatizing others because of their condition is supported biblically. The Bible clearly stated that Jesus came for the sick. He spent time with marginal people, not church people. Went to dangerous places. I have done that. Went to dangerous places and was criticized for hanging out with sinners. If anyone had the right to consider himself better than those people, I think it would have been him. However, his actions set the precedent for Christians to incorporate people who live with addictions and other struggles into the community. Pursuing someone. And this is one of those things that really diverges, I think, from what the status quo is. We should pursue someone who is struggling with addiction. If, as we've talked about above, and you mentioned earlier, exogenous substances hijack this endogenous system, the person who is addicted is unlikely to seek community that may restart that system. And that's what we see. We see people, they isolate. Most treatment protocols, both medical and psychological, are predicated on the idea that the addicted person must want and seek help. And we propose that the biblical concepts of seeking those who wander, even those who do not desire help, are needed to reduce substance misuse. Jesus himself said, "What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain and go in search of the one that went astray?" And James said, "My brother, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whatever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins." So this going after, it gets harder and harder as we go through this. And then refer less. Going even further than being with, for, and pursuing others, we believe that biblically we should keep people with us rather than routinely referring them away from the church. Jesus did not refer people away. When thousands of people were sitting listening to his teaching, he told his disciples, don't send them away. Feed them yourself with what you have. They had very little, but he blessed it. Scripture tells us to go the extra mile, give our cloaks also. It does not say send them to a social service agency or the Goodwill store. There are benefits of social services. Let me say, we have 2 people from our church right now, right at this moment, that are at a social service place in Johnson City. So they're helping. There are benefits of those, but there's added benefit, we believe, of keeping people close and walking through the difficult times with them rather than delegating help to outside agencies that may or may not base that help in scriptural principles. I am not advocating we be a cult and do it all ourselves. Let me just say that. But rather than referring someone away, accompany them. Go to the Goodwill store. Pick out clothes with them. Sit and listen to the social service advice. Go with them to their medication, to get their medication, and talk about alternatives and tapering, whatever. So it's the keeping them close. And finally, we believe that along with education about substance use and addiction, that people should be taught biblical principles for living. Biblical teachings are not lists of rules that somebody effortfully obeys. We believe that it's central to help people understand who they are in the eyes of God, made in his image, valuable, worthy of love, and who God is, sovereign, creator of the universe. A key theme throughout the Bible is the identity of the people of God. This began at the time of creation, making man in our own image. It's seen in the relationship between believers and God. To all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave right to become the children of God. You're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, people of his own possession. Once you were not a people, now you're God's people. So this belonging, this sense of identity, this value and worth. So knowing who we are as humans is central to perceiving our own value and is key to flourishing. So let me do a little bit about the overlap between these. And I have no idea what time I'm supposed to finish, but I'll make it.
Could you go just a few more minutes?
Yep. I think I can do it in a few, and then you'll have questions. Trust me, you'll have questions. So there's an arbitrary distinction among the 3, but we think that there is overlap among them. Depending on who draws the Venn diagram, they may overlap entirely. Some may be bigger. I, as you can see, think that they all fall within spiritual, but that's me. You can draw your own Venn diagram. So substance misuse does cause physical changes. So to say it's not a physical disorder would be incorrect. However, the disease model as currently promoted fails to recognize brain plasticity and potential healing. Most popular views of addiction currently describe it as relapsing and permanent. We know that promoting the idea of chronic and incurable may actually reduce treatment effectiveness. Psychological research shows us that if someone thinks there is no hope, they are less likely to get better. So just by saying it is permanent, it won't get better. There are people in recovery for years and decades. Obviously, it can change, but if you tell somebody they won't get better, they likely won't. Yet for someone, so for all of these 3, to ignore any of the others would be incomplete. And so what we're proposing is an explanation for addiction that my theological child calls wraparound theology, but you can call it whatever you want to. It's not published yet. But it incorporates all 3. From a theological spiritual perspective, we believe that God ordained humans to physiologically be predisposed to need community with other humans. We believe that Scripture informs how best to live, which includes loving one another and caring for one another, thus maintaining that community. We believe this physiological predisposition to live in community plays out this way. Our opioid receptors are filled with opioids made by our own bodies as we bond with and interact with other people, initially a nurturing caregiver. Even in rodent studies, we know that rat pups who are separated from their mothers will call for their mothers unless they're given an opioid. If they are given an opioid, they will not call for the mother. It appears that activating the opioid receptors with that exogenous opioid fills the need for the mother. If we're neglected and have little interaction as a child, or live in a dangerous or threatening situation, ACEs, we produce fewer of those endogenous opioids and receptors are not filled. Causes discomfort, and the result is seeking to fill those receptors, maybe in some less ideal way. This could result in taking drugs to fill that void, to numb emotional pain, due to lack of community, regardless of whether we have or have not had good relationships and produced endogenous opioids, using exogenous opioids, either through recreational use or treating pain or whatever, we know that that will activate our receptors and may still replace and downregulate that endogenous system. We also know now that methamphetamine and other substances still activate opioid receptors. So to say, oh, well, this is just for opioids, it's not. All of these could be working in that same way. So once they're activated by the external substances, there's a downregulation, and we become reliant on those substances. So I'm going to skip a little bit of this and just say, because I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. But what we're practicing is that what we would like to demonstrate practically and scientifically is that we can create enough intensity of community that we can upregulate that endogenous opioid system. Some rodent work has been done, but we would like to see if indeed having enough wraparound community can take the place of those exogenous opioids and restart that system so that rather than being needing the exogenous opioid, that we replace that with seeking community with other people. So basically people become your drug, is the idea. All right, so what might this look like? So it will require a great deal of effort. I just said you got to be with them, for them, seek them and keep them. And that sounds very labor intensive. And oh man, it is. So it will require a great deal of effort on the part of people providing that. Where will that come from? There are not enough government dollars, let me tell you, to fund enough people to be 24/7 on call to seek and keep people who are struggling with opioid addiction. So that's where the church comes into play. Churches are the most prolific social organizations, at least in Appalachia. I don't know about the rest of the world. And so what we are trying to do is show that this can happen through our efforts. With the Holy Friendship Collaborative, we're trying to motivate the churches in our area to see this as a Christian calling. This is a calling of you as a believer to care for other humans, love them, seek them, and so forth. And so I want to just really quickly give you a snippet of what this might look like. And this is another part of what we're doing. And like my third byline on there was president of Uplift, which sort of exists right now. So what might it look like? It might get funded if I can get a grant written by December 15th. So briefly, what might it look like? Physically, we know addiction results in isolation. Isolation reduces the chance of an individual's body to release those endogenous opioids. Increasing social connection should reduce the drive to misuse. And so we want endeavors that foster connections. And so what we are doing, and I'm not going to even read this, I'm going to tell you very quickly, one of the aspects of this, we're in a very small church. I mean, like 25 to 35 people on a Sunday. About a third of us are employed in Drive. And so transportation is huge. And so what we're trying to do is use transportation for people who need transportation as a way to strategically build relationships with those people. They're beholden to us. They've got to get from here to there. But while we're getting from here to there, we're going to love you and seek you and call you and make sure you get there and keep you and answer your texts and go to Waffle House at 3 a.m. That's just a story I told them. So that's one way of doing this, is coming up with something that churches could do that really addresses a need in the area of people who live with addiction. And so that is one of many, but we would like to pilot it, market it, and all of that. But at first, you have to sell the church on, yeah, it's our thing, and we are willing to do it. And so we're at that hump right now. That's my theory. Oh, yeah, there's the helping. Oh, yeah, just a friend in a car. My best slide, just a friend in a car. Yes.
Thanks so much. And just by way of background, I'm a physician.
Mm-hmm.
So some of my questions come from that. I'm trained in Appalachia. Have a lot of family in Southwest Virginia, very, very close to Johnson City.
Uh-huh.
I really appreciated the way in which you are sort of calling us to a more foundational approach to the intricate demand side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And you might say, I'll start with a bit of a comment, drawing a tangent to the previous talk. I think we might say that syndemics require synthetic responses, right? And I would say one thing about the Lancet article that was cited, that I'm not crazy about, is that it talks about two disease states, so we're already starting to biologicalize
Right.
a syndemic. On the other hand, so when I think about synthetic responses, just in my own experience as a clinician, I wonder if we can't avoid supply, and if we can't avoid supply versus demand, in part because of, I would say, two poverties. So the first poverty is socioeconomic poverty. That, of course, being an important part of many social problems and social challenges. But I'd say even more important the poverty of our institutions. I mean, the way in which we get HRSA grants, the way in which we get
Right.
legislation passed is dramatically siloed. And so how do we move socially to a more synthetic response where, say we create wonderful communities, but then those communities of people are going to their physicians and their physicians are saying, here's what you got to do, here's my way of thinking about it, right? So how do we blend these supply side, demand side
Right.
problems really into a synthetic response in your view?
Wow. That's hard. That's hard. And I didn't hear explicitly the economic factor, but the thing that, I could take the totally theological and say, save them all and they'll do better. Yeah, that's great. But that's not happening. But the appealing to the humanity of whoever it is, wherever, would be my goal. I don't see that happening necessarily. I think one of the things is the economic drivers, you say, like HRSA and funding. And the thing that has hit me in the face over and over with this is I'm not a big believer in legislate everything, but the ability for economics to drive things. I mentioned the $44,000 a week for the physicians. Our buprenorphine guidelines were written by lobbyists for buprenorphine docs. It's like if nobody's watching everything, these things happen because somebody, if you can trace it, and somebody is getting something. Even the physicians, I think a lot of them are well-meaning, but a drug company is sending this beautiful young woman in there to tell you this is the only way to treat this. It's like there's so many factors working against that, and so many factors working against even having the relationship with the doctor. It's like the physician wants to do well, but with managed care, I've got 12 minutes, or whatever. And it's like, how can I see what's in that person's life and they trust me enough to recommend, get in this social group, or this is a church that will, or whatever, And so it's like all the pieces are moving at once. And I see, unfortunately, there's some bad apples in there with very loud voices at times. And so it's like every time you make a move in a positive direction, somebody sees that as a threat and comes out with a really creative, well-funded way to undo it. And it sounds really paranoid, I know, but it's just, I keep running into it. It's like how I think so. I hate to say I think innocently, naively, I guess, that I think everybody wants good for people. And I hate it that I keep running into that is not true. Because I also mentor people, high risk, high need felony offenders with addictions, and go into the jails and go into drug dealer places and pick them up when they relapse and stuff like that. And so I see it very much from the person's side. And we talked about the victim sort of thing. And some they just don't know how to get out. And people are here saying, but I can make money if you'll stay a victim. And that just is not okay. But that's a hard thing to legislate, It's just like, everyone must now be nice to each other and not exploit anyone. Okay, that's the law. I don't think that works. So what I try to do is go around and inspire pockets of people. Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit more to the institutional challenge of getting churches on board? One of the things that was most striking to me in your presentation was that when I was doing research on methamphetamine about 13 years ago, church was probably the last place that most folks who were using methamphetamine would feel comfortable taking their problems. And they experienced that as another degree of hurt.
Yes.
So I find myself agreeing with your kind of general thesis. But at
The goal
same
is
time,
great, but the practice is,
the,
yeah.
the institutional challenge of that. So I was just curious if you felt like churches were maybe now more receptive in the decade since, or if you feel like you're encountering the same difficulty getting churches on board with this work.
Some are, because it has become, I think the medicalization of it has made it almost more okay. Oh, well, he's just sick. It's not all sin, and I get that. And so now the government is dichotomizing against the moral. But it means that they can come and say, oh, well, it's not moral, so leave me alone on that. So that's a problem. But one of the things that in my research lab we're doing right now is kind of a readiness of the church. Which ways are the stigma going? Is it stigma of the church toward the person who's addicted, the person who's addicted toward the church, the medical community toward the church toward the medical community, and also employers, because unemployment, we have gotten so many grants in our area. Like, we can hold out our hands and say opioids and people will drop money to do things, but yet what that's done is made corporations say, I'm not coming there, everybody's addicted. So we've shot ourselves in the foot by saying, look how bad off we are. Yeah, we're not coming there. So we can't get industry, and so it just self-perpetuates. But we are studying that. One of the things that the Holy Friendship Collaborative, what we do is we are trying to mobilize those churches through, we partnered with Duke to use a program that they had, which is called the Reimagining Health Collaborative, to get a small group of churches who are willing to kind of deep dive over a couple of years to find their niche and study this and train their people. And it has been pulling teeth. Our first cohort had 9, 6 showed up. I think we've got 4 left. That's not going to work where we are. But we do have a full-time executive director who goes out, and she said the thing that's been most successful is meeting with small groups of pastors who have affected people in their church. Well, everybody has affected people in the churches, but they know that they are effective. It's in their own lives and what they're dealing with. And so they're desperate enough to say, can you help us get this going? And so I think at this point it's so large that you can't ignore it anymore. But some of the things we've looked at is, I think most of the churches that we have interacted with, it hasn't been as much of a, oh, go fix yourself kind of attitude. It's, we want to do something, we don't know what to do, we're afraid we'll make it worse, we're not physicians, experts should do that, or I am different from that person, the us, them, it's me and I can help this person, now I feel good because I did this thing, as opposed to taking them and keeping them and they're just in your friend group, and those are 2 different levels of intimacy. But so I think it's less, even we had a lot of recovery meetings and things like that going on, but it's like the recovery meeting is on Thursday, and once you get good enough, you can come to real church, and so that is a barrier. That's a barrier. So, yes.
You almost broached it, but since you are a quantitative person as well as a spiritual person, have you looked at the comparable results of the AA model versus what you are arguing? Not that they're necessarily exclusive, I think, though I heard at the end of what you just said.
There's a lot of quantitative stuff already out there on success of AA, and when anybody says, I want to use evidence-based treatment, that's become the buzzword for MAT. But there's a SAMHSA grant that just came out. Don't get it because I need it. But they're saying evidence-based, and evidence-based can be anything that has research support. Well, there are decades of research support for AA, for 12-step programs. There really is. Now, the way those play out, some are very biblically focused. Some are very ambiguous. It's like whatever your power is and whatever you think, and there's a lot of interpretation. So, but there is quantitative benefit to that. There was a second part of your question and I lost it.
No,
Is that kind of?
I think that answers it.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
So I was just thinking about that kind of gap between the endogenous and the exogenous, and there was a sort of thing that kind of flashed up in my head, which is within sort of drug taking context, and I think this speaks to Bill's work as well. There are really kind of intimate forms of sociality within drug-taking communities, as it were, pursuit of drugs, the taking of drugs, and thinking especially about what demands kind of drugs respond to. And my own work thinking about kind of both this intersection of opioids and methamphetamine. People who don't sleep for 7 days, and the worlds and the fantasies and the hallucinations they create within those spaces speaks to a kind of connectivity. So I just wonder, like, within that kind of thinking how you go from a kind of sort of this relational model to this endogenous, exogenous, what these sort of hypersocialities kind of, do they throw a spanner in the works of that? And if so, like, how do you change kind of that kind of community into a different kind of community, given that in some contexts that's the most people have? Right.
That is hard, and that might be a next step because the thing is, yeah, there is this huge connection among drug using communities, and so much of the recommendation is new people, new places, new things, new people, new places. It's like, leave everyone you love and transplant yourself somewhere. And if there is not that waiting with open arms community ready for you when you get there, you're going to go back. I mean, duh, I would relapse too, you know? And so I think there's so many things in what you just said. But I'm gonna land on that piece though, because it is, and when you get into the, people are having spiritual experiences just by igniting things with the drugs themselves, and that's a whole, yeah. And is that spiritual, and what kind of spiritual, and all those? I'm going to leave that to some other people to study. But I do think there's something, if you could take a community and envelop them in a loving community and retool them, that would be fantastic. But I can't even imagine how that would play out. It would be wonderful, but it's a lot of manpower. I got to motivate a lot more people. Oh, and I know the thing that when you were talking about the meetings that I wanted to mention, I listened to a podcast of some absolutely non-Christian drug users. But I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about, and this so plays into this, and what they were saying is, they were talking about a friend that had overdosed, and it was kind of like his memorial chat or whatever. And but they said they all just sort of spontaneously started saying, yeah, well, I've got to have my meeting. Well, if I'm having a bad day, wherever I am, I can walk in any city, I can walk into a meeting, and those are my people. And they accept me, and they don't judge me, and I can talk it out. And I'm thinking, that is what the church is supposed to be. You know, it's like they have just said, this is the thing that keeps me okay. And so even when you look at that, even if it's not a religiously based meeting, that level of connectivity and that acceptance, that immediate, we love you, you are us, I think is that therapeutic thing that I'm trying to motivate.